Good afternoon and welcome to the monthly truck stop webinar of the Transportation Risk Specialists. If you haven't noticed by now, this is not Tommy Ruke. I know that you're disappointed, but it's my opportunity to host today. This is Rich Bren. Rich Byrne, as Tommy sometimes refers to me. Many of you know of me. You've heard of me, maybe seen me on the stage with Tommy doing some different various educational programs. I'm a truck insurance geek like a lot of you, maybe geekier than most, but I work in a program manager role for a wonderful company based out of Ohio, but unfortunately I have to live down in Arizona as opposed to Cleveland. So that's a quick summary of who I am. My opportunity today to help host this webinar. As was noted, these are part of our monthly ongoing educational formats, happen the second Thursday of every month at 2 p.m. Intended to help us all stay current on industry issues. Informational purpose only, not intended to be for CE credits. As you know, a different CE program does exist that allows us to continue to keep going with insurance education specific to motor carriers. And if you want to know more information about that, you can see the ID at the bottom of the page here that tells you how to get a hold of Beth, Tommy, and learn more about that. As was noted, this is a part of the ongoing monthly. If you have any problems, and Beth, I am not able to advance right now, if you can help me. If you have any problems during this program, please call in, email, and let them know. You can likewise send a note in the chat window if you have a question during the event of something that was stated. As is noted here, if you have any kind of audio problems, you can drop that in the chat window or give a call, and we'll try to get that corrected for you. Today, the opportunity that you have before you is to revisit the basics. I think we know what those are, but in reality, a good coach of any program, you always have to get back to it. And basics means something unique and special to us in the transportation world, because it's about driver behaviors being recorded and the activities of motor carrier management. Our friends at the Central Analysis Bureau have shared a lot of information with us about their knowledge, their methods, the products that they make available. And today, specifically, we have the opportunity to hear again from Tiana Cain, a Vice President with the Central Analysis Bureau. She works in a business development role there, a professional role of helping them develop their programs and get it out to the street, get it out to the agents, to the insurance companies, the MGAs, et cetera, that use it. Many of you know her insurance background. She's a truck insurance geek herself, having come out of a product development analyst underwriting role for a certain company based on where she lives down in Greenville, South Carolina. So while she has a New York employer, she doesn't have to live there. She gets to enjoy beautiful South Carolina. My story, many of you have heard it in the past, has to do with the first highly publicized chameleon carrier that I can remember, and I think I recall it because I was involved in living it. Back in the day, there was a company called Gunther Leasing Clock Transport. Tiana used it in many illustrations over the years to show you how a chameleon can be identified inside their system, but the CAB tool provides not only that, but a great resource to help us underwrite, to help us know what's really going on. So there are many tools that they offer. This is really not an infomercial. It's not a timeshare presentation to try to get you to buy into something. But Tommy has told us all many times over, you need good tools, you need methods, you need to find ways to help your customers, and that's what today is. Explaining the basics as a reminder, and also what can we do with tools like CAB provides, that we can still see scores, that we can still understand what's going on. And you know, the online views are gone. Tiana and I were talking about coming into this. You know, we used to kind of have a visual flight plan that we could use of looking online and seeing some things. Well, they're gone. You need to use tools. You need to use instruments like CAB provides in order to do that analysis today. I'm not going to steal any more of her time or try to get into the program because she's got some really good stuff. So Tiana, at this point in time, I'm going to flip it over to you, and please share with us your wisdom as to what can be done to keep us all out of trouble going forward.
Well, Rich, you certainly left me some big shoes to fill, so thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tiana Cain with CAB. As Rich said, our intent is not to make this an infomercial, rather an education session. And so we are going to go through and talk about what the basic scores are, what they mean, where they came from, and what the FAST Act meant and how that has impacted our industry, and then what we've done at CAB to continue to enable you to have all the information you need to continue to make good underwriting decisions. So as you guys know, I'm sure there's nobody on the line today that's a stranger to who CAB is. We've been around for over 75 years. We're very proud of that heritage, and I'm very proud to be a part of a company that has been focused on the insurance industry for that length of time. Our mission is to facilitate better risk selection through educated underwriting, but I do just want to throw one side note in there. CAB is not a tool dedicated solely to underwriting. If you're listening today and you work for a company that has a claims department, a loss control, risk improvement, actuarial, SIU, keep in mind that everything that I'm going to go through with you today is also beneficial for a myriad of uses within the insurance industry, and it's not limited to underwriting. But today's focus will be on the educated underwriting. And our objective is to discuss the basic scores and the impact of the FAST Act and the changes to Analysis Central. So we've added a lot of new features and a lot of information. And for those of you who have never heard the term Analysis Central, we'll talk about that as we get further into today's session. So the basic scores. Let's talk about where they came from, what they mean. I have the privilege of working with many different individuals throughout the insurance industry. It's probably one of my favorite aspects of my job, is getting to speak with all of you on a regular basis. And I felt it was important when discussing this topic to go through and talk about what the basic scores are, what they mean, where they came from, how they work, because there's still a lot of misunderstanding about this. And I feel like in order to address what CAB has done to combat what happened with the FAST Act, it's also important to understand even what the basic scores are, what they mean, where they came from. So I'm going to be dating myself a little bit in how long I've been in the transportation industry. I actually started long before the basic scores came about. Prior to the basic scores, the DOT had SAFER, SafeStat, and Licensing and Insurance as the three websites they used for information on motor carriers. And the SafeStat website was replaced with SMS in 2010 when the basic scores were originally rolled out. Now, it was an interesting time period to be in the insurance industry and in the transportation industry in particular, because they did about a 2-year marketing campaign, they being the FMCSA, on the basic scores. It was a pretty big deal for those of you who were around at that time. They did a big marketing campaign on CSA 2010, CSA 2010, CSA 2010. Well, we are no stranger to the DOT and their deadlines, and sometimes how those deadlines get stretched and twisted a little bit. And in this case, the basic scores, the deadline was 2010. They managed to squeak out one of the basic categories by December of 2010, but the full program was not implemented until 2011. So it's important to remember that this is still a relatively new system that the DOT came up with. And in 2013, there were some major changes to the methodology. So they changed some of the categories, shifted some of the violations. So keep in mind that even what you're looking at today really only has a little over 2 years worth of actual history. So the categories were a pretty significant shift in some of the major areas. They used to have a cargo related that got moved into vehicle. So there were some pretty major categories. So keep that in mind when you're looking at this information, that it is still relatively new, the methodology is still relatively new, and what you're looking at as the current methodology is still relatively new. So the purpose of the basic scores, that's a really important aspect of understanding the basic scores. The purpose of the basic scores was to give the FMCSA the ability to target motor carriers for intervention in high-risk categories. And our CEO, Gene Gardner, put a great note in this particular slide, not to increase jury verdicts. Unfortunately, one of the negative or side effects of the basic scores is that very issue, is that it did in some cases increase jury verdicts. But really the DOT's entire mindset behind it was targeted intervention. Now, let's talk about why that is such an important issue. It's interesting because every time I do a training session covering the topic of chameleon carriers, and Rich just recently mentioned the topic of chameleon carriers, I'm asked the question, well, doesn't the DOT stop these? And the answer is, of course. There are regulations around chameleon carriers. However, the transportation industry far outnumbers the safety industry. So the actual enforcement industry is greatly outnumbered compared to the actual number of motor carriers out there operating. And so what the entire purpose behind CSA 2010, and now they obviously dropped the 2010 from their name, but the CSA initiative and the SMS website, is to give the very small enforcement industry the tools they need to target the motor carriers that pose the highest risk, to give them the tools they need to target those carriers, find them, and deal with those safety issues. The DOT has a very strong mission of enforcing safety on the roads, and so it's very important for them to use their limited resources to figure this out. That is the entire purpose behind the basic scores. That's exactly what they did, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what these mean and how they accomplish that. So the one thing to keep in mind is that they are not numbers. I often hear, oh, the basic scores, and that's technically the terminology that's used for them, or the CAB scores, another way that they're beginning to be referred to as. But keep in mind that they are not an actual pure score. They are a relativity. They are a peer group ranking. The methodology for the basic scores is actually very, very, very complex. The initial look at it, if you look at the violations and how they are weighted, seems like it's simple, but it is actually far from simple. What the DOT did is they created peer groups for motor carriers, and they used different things to create those peer groups. So they used vehicle miles traveled, the number of units of fleet reports, the number of inspections they have, and using that information, they came up with different peer groups, and each of the basic categories is created using a different peer group method. And then they rank motor carriers amongst themselves. So when you are looking at the information on a basic score, what you are actually looking at is that motor carrier's peer group ranking. Now, the reason I take the time to explain this to you is to help understand, A, what this means. So when you look at a motor carrier and they have a 69 in hours of service, that is their percentile ranking. They actually rank in the 69th percentile for motor carriers in their peer group. Now, it's because it is such a complex methodology that goes into creating these, it's very, very important to understand what it means so you don't misuse the information. And one of the questions that we've been asked before is there a way to predict the future basic scores? I can look at violations that are about to time off and say, okay, if I take these off, what will their basic score look like? Or if I historically trend out their score, what will their basic score look like? There's a very, very particular reason why CAB has chosen not to do that, and that is because it is impossible to predict a peer group ranking. Motor carriers can do absolutely nothing in 1 month. They may not get another violation. None of their violations may even time off in a single month. But if the peer group around them changes, their basic scores can change. So keep in mind that there are so many moving pieces that calculate the basic scores that it is impossible to predict out a future score. Now, ideally, if you look at a motor carrier and they decrease the number of violations they receive, as long as their peer group is not getting better at a rate exponentially quicker than them, then their score should ideally go down. But again, the DOT is constantly looking for the worst carriers in the group, so should the peer groups around them get better at a quicker rate than them, even if they're not getting any new violations, their basic scores may not change. So it's important to understand that it is not as simple as 1, 2, 3. There are a lot of different moving pieces, and that's why CAB sticks to displaying the current score. And we're very conscientious of making sure that the information that's provided to you is not necessarily a prediction, but rather an accurate calculation of that information. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail as we go down the slide, but I did want to talk about how complex this methodology is, how many different moving pieces, and most importantly, help you understand that the term score is actually almost an unfair term to use when we're talking about the basic scores, because they are more of a ranking and a relativity.
And I want to interject just how important that is, because time and time again, I've seen it happen, and I've dug into some of these things, and you're seeing improvements, and yet this number doesn't seem to be going down. And what that's about is your peers are getting better quicker than you are. As Tiana said, I just want to confirm that. So you can be trying to help a motor carrier if you're an agent. You can be looking at it as an underwriter going, well, they aren't getting any better. Well, the rest of the world is getting better quicker than them, and it's not that they're bad. It's this ranking. It's this peer group thing, which again is the whole reason that these things came out of public view, but it is still the targeted intervention and enforcement. So, that doesn't, just because the rest of the world, the public can't see it, doesn't mean that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Enforcement officers aren't looking at this every day, and they're still coming after these motor carriers. So it's a great point that she brings up. Sometimes motor carriers change peer groups, and they don't know it, and that's why they can't understand why their group, numbers changed. And again, we in the public domain can't see that happening anymore. And so getting inside the motor carrier's PIN data, and possibly with some of these tools that Tiana has, maybe they could historically pull it. But that is a very difficult thing to define and explain to people. It's part of the complexity. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
No, thank you, Rich, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that input. And just one side note, this is why it is also very important for the motor carrier's MCS 150 information to be accurate, because they pull the vehicle miles traveled and the fleet size to calculate the peer groups from the MCS 150. So a motor carrier that is not accurately completing that is going to potentially damage their basic scores, because it could incorrectly classify them in a peer group. And likewise, a motor carrier who chooses to intentionally distort their basic scores can do so by false reporting on the MCS 150. So just keep in mind, it is a very delicate number, and it is not one that should be or can be easily manipulated. So the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how the basic scores are compiled, where they come from, kind of how they work. It's pretty simple, actually. The basic scores are updated every month on the DOT's time frame, and they are actually calculated using the new inspection and violation data. So each inspection that qualifies for, violation that qualifies for a basic category, and as a side note, not every violation that the DOT cites will actually appear in a basic category. So that is why if you're looking at the CAB report, the inspections accidents page may be different from our CSA page, because there are certain violations that do not have a basic score and would not be counted in the basic category. So just keep in mind, not every violation qualifies for in the basic categories, but those that do are assigned a severity weight. So the DOT calculated the different violations and said which violations are more likely to contribute to a crash, and they are given a higher severity weight. And then they are also assigned a time weight. So the DOT has 3 time frames that they use: 0 to 6 months, 6 to 12, and then 12 plus months, so anything over a year. And depending upon how recent the violation is, how much that violation is held against the motor carrier, and then they use that information to then calculate the peer group relativity. So keep in mind that the newer the violation, the more it is going to be held against the motor carrier. And carriers will only have a score if there's sufficient data in a category for them to have a score. So I'm often asked the question, Tiana, why did they not have any basic scores? If they do not have adequate inspection and violation data and a basic score, they may not have a category. They may not have anything in that category, and it won't show up on the CAB site. So it's not uncommon to see carriers that do not have all 6 of the basics, the general basics. Now, at CAB, we're actually displaying 8, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But it's not uncommon to see carriers that just have 1 or 2, or if they're a new company and they don't have a lot of inspection data, they may not have any at all. So they're updated monthly, and it's going to be based on the inspection and violation data. Each violation has a different weight that's assigned to it, and depending upon how recent the violation is how much that violation is held against that motor carrier. So the good news is, if you have a motor carrier who is actively making improvements in their fleet, assuming that their peer group isn't changing rapidly as well, that as violations time off, assuming they don't get any new violations, then ideally their scores would begin to go down.
Tiana, when will you comment on ISS?
That's a good question, Bren. I did it again, Bren. Rich Bren.
That's okay. Cain.
That's a good question, Rich. And I didn't actually put anything in the slide about or in the presentation today about the ISS, but I will take a second to comment on it since you brought it up, and it is something definitely valid and worth speaking about. At CAB, we've recreated the ISS score, and just like the basic score, which we'll talk about in a minute, how we've replicated the methodology. But we've taken the DOT's methodology. It is not something that CAB created. We take their methodology, their data, use our computer to calculate it, which is why we call it the ISS CAB score. But that is the score that the DOT uses at weigh stations to determine who they are going to inspect when a carrier goes through a weigh station. And it is also a complex methodology, not necessarily like the basic scores. And believe it or not, the basic scores are also included in the methodology for the ISS. Just like the basic scores, it is updated on a monthly basis, and it is another one of the tools that the DOT has created to target motor carriers for intervention. Again, you can't have every vehicle going through the weigh station stopped and inspected. So how do we figure out who we want to inspect? And that's exactly what the ISS methodology was intended to do, and that's how the DOT uses it. What's interesting about all of this is, and I'm glad you brought this up, Rich, is that the ISS score was something that was public on SafeStat, and I mentioned SafeStat just a minute ago, and was not moved over to the SMS website. And there wasn't quite as big of an uproar about it as there was the basic scores, and that's primarily because the DOT did a really good job marketing the basic scores when they first came out. And so it became something we as the insurance industry became very dependent upon, and those users of CAB have now become dependent upon seeing the ISS score and getting access to that information. That was a good question to ask, and that's about as much time as I have to go through the ISS, but is there anything, Rich, you think I should identify beyond what I said?
Again, if you're an agent trying to work with your customer or trying to identify where somebody stands, you really need to be asking the truck line management, what's your ISS? They need to know that. They need to know if they're going to be inspected or if they're optional or if they're on a pass. And if they think that just because they have a clean slate when they go out there to look, that doesn't mean that they're going to be in a pass category, because the feds want to get data in here. So it's an important thing. We won't dwell on it, but the ISS is really a critical thing for you as an agent talking to a trucker to know what it is and what direction their ISS is going, as impacted by all this basic SMS info.
Absolutely, and Rich, makes a very valid point. Carriers that are flagged for intervention are more likely to be pulled over and inspected. More likely they are to be cited for violations. The more likely they have violations, the higher their basic score stay. It becomes a cyclical process. And so if you can really get your motor carriers to buckle down and comply with regulations, get out of that red or yellow ISS category, that too, just by the nature of having fewer inspections, should help decrease their overall score and performance with the DOT. And that was a great question, great point. So the basic scores, we all remember that fateful day in December when SMS went down and the basic scores were gone. And that is because of the FAST Act. And in the FAST Act, there was language in the wording that had a congressional mandate to remove the scores while the methodology is being studied. So while technically it's temporary, they've been given 18 months to study the methodology, report back on their findings, and then the next steps are kind of up in the air. So there's a lot of unknowns about what the future holds for the basic scores. All I can tell you right now is that we are looking at a minimum of 18 months before they come back. And I say come back with a little bit of hesitancy, because really what's happening is a study's being conducted, and there's really no telling what's going to happen until that study's conducted and until we understand what recommendations are made while that study, or as a result of that study, I should say. But one thing that is very, very important to understand is the basic scores did not go away. Enforcement is still using them. They are still a part of their intervention process. The only difference today between what happened in December and today is that they are not available on the public websites. But they did not go away. They're still very much alive and well and still very much a part of the enforcement process. All right, so what did CAB do to respond to the basic scores? So what we did is we took the DOT's methodology, which, by the way, as I referred to earlier, is extremely complex. And we took the DOT score and we created our CAB basic score. So we take their data, their methodology, our machine, and we created the scores. Now, the reason that we refer to it as a proprietary CAB basic score is because it is our computer doing the crunching, which means that there is the possibility for us to have a rounding difference here or there. There's the possibility for there to be subtle differences between what CAB is calculating and what the DOT is calculating. Now, obviously, accuracy is something that's very important to CAB, so we've done a lot of testing of the data, and so far we found that our scores are on target with the DOT's scores. We're very proud of what we've done at CAB, but we do just want to clarify it is considered now the CAB basic score, and that's because it is our computer doing the crunching. So keep in mind that there's a potential for us to be off a little bit here and there. We're going to continue to test and continue to ensure that our scores are as close to the DOT scores as we can get them, but we do just want to clarify that it is considered now the CAB basic score, but it is using their data and their methodology. And we will continue to update the scores on the same schedule as the DOT. So essentially, CAB's users were not impacted by the change of the FAST Act, negatively at least. I'm going to go through here in just a few minutes and show you some of the positive impacts that these changes had on our ability to provide this information to our users. And I got ahead of myself. CAB users were not affected by the FAST Act, as they will continue to have access and underwrite with knowledge. In addition to now being able to display additional categories, and I'm going to show that to you in just a second, we have also developed unique and important tools to help you understand the basic scores. Part of the reason why I went into so much history and information about the basic scores introducing this topic was to help you understand what this information means, so when you're using it, you can make educated decisions about a motor carrier, be it from an underwriting, claims, loss control perspective, etc. It's important to understand what this means in order to make an educated decision about it. And we've taken it one step further. We're not just going to give you the basic scores and set them out there, but we're going to break them down for you so you can look at what things are driving a motor carrier's basic scores. Is it what types of violations they've had? How many violations have they had in that particular category? Which vehicles are causing the violations? So at CAB, we focus not just on providing the data for you, but making it meaningful, because it's very easy to look at colors in the CAB report. And as a matter of fact, the last session we did was focused on that very topic, the colors in the CAB report. What we want to do is kind of take you to the next level and give you the ability to see beyond the colors and make an educated decision given the entire picture. And that's why we've developed all these unique and in-depth tools when it comes to looking at and reviewing the information on the basic scores. All right, so for the sake of the discussion and the topic that Tommy asked me to speak to today, which is how CAB responded to the basic scores, there are 4 places primarily that you can access the basic scores while in the CAB report. It's going to be on the general page. That's the first page you see when you first log in. The CSA page, which is our page dedicated just to the basic scores. The history page, where we graph out for you the motor carrier's history, and Analysis Central. If you're unfamiliar with Analysis Central, that's one of our newest features we have introduced to the CAB report. And one side note, we also do have the basic scores displayed on the carrier search page if you use the quick preview function. That's intended to be a quick snapshot, but it is also another location in the CAB report where you can view the basic scores. So on the general page, when you first log in, you're going to see the relativities. Now, I picked a carrier that had some different colors so we can talk about some of the information that you're going to see. Now, if you look at this particular graph, you'll notice that some of the bars are blue and some of the bars are red. Now, when we make a bar red on the general page, that is to let you know that they are in alert status in that particular category. A motor carrier will be in alert status, or can be in alert status, for 2 reasons. One will be because they are above the threshold. Now, the DOT has 2 thresholds that they've set, and it depends on which category you're talking about. And you'll notice there are 2 colored bars. One is orange, one is purple. Those indicate the 2 different thresholds, and we'll tell you off to the side which threshold represents which category. So if they are above the threshold, they will be in alert status. They can also be in alert status if they have received a serious violation in the past 12 months. So you may see a motor carrier whose bar is below one of those two indicator lines on the screen, one of those orange, that orange or purple, but they may have a red bar because they are in alert status for having a serious violation in the past 12 months. So keep in mind that they can be in alert status for one of two reasons, either above the threshold or because they have had a serious violation in the past 12 months. Now on this screen, you're going to be able to see a quick summary of what their peer group rankings are in the particular categories. And again, they're not always going to have a category listed if they do not have sufficient data to have a basic score in that category. Now, if you'll notice, some of you who are a little bit more savvy and know the data may notice something different about this particular. We have unsafe driving, hours of service, driver fitness, controlled substance, vehicle maintenance, and there's a new category showing up there, hazmat. The DOT actually has two extra categories that previously were not available to the public, the hazmat basic and the crash basic. Because CAB is now calculating our own score, we are able to display both the crash and hazmat basic when they apply on our site. So this is a good example of what you would see if you came across a carrier who had a hazmat. And if they have a crash basic, it will also be listed here. Now, one quick thing is a side note, and I don't have a specific slide for this, but I would like to address it since we're on the topic. The hazmat and the crash basic are set up just like the rest of the basics. There are violations. They're weighed, time weighed, so the hazmat refers to the hazmat violations. The crash basic refers to crashes, DOT reportable crashes, fatality, injury, tow away. The DOT treats crashes just like they do violations. Fatality, injury, tow away each have their own severity weight. They will be multiplied by a time weight, and that's how the crash basic is calculated. So if you come across a motor carrier that has a crash or a hazmat basic, those will be new information, something that was not available prior to CAB providing this information, and we're going to display it on the General tab in the Summary page. Now, one of the cool things that we have built into our site that a lot of users are not aware of, if you click on one of those bars that I just had up on the screen, if you click, and so I clicked into Vehicle Maintenance, it will actually give you a graph that breaks down the number of violations or which violations they've had in each category. And Rich actually made a great observation today as we were going through the slides preparing for today's session. He said, when you look at this, is every carrier going to look exactly like this? And the answer is no. You will only see these different categories that show up underneath the bars if they have had a violation in that category. So you may click on one of those bars on the General tab, open up this screen that I have displayed right here, and you may not see but 2 or 3 categories if that's the only type of violations they have received. So this drill down is only going to be available when they have a basic score and if they have enough information to have this. So I don't believe we're actually going to display this graph yet for the crash and the hazmat basics, but you should see it for the other 5 that are normally available, the hours of service, unsafe driving, controlled substance, driver fitness, etc. So this is a great way to see what violations a motor carrier is having to contribute to their basic scores on a very high level perspective. We're actually going to break it down for you on a detail level on the CSA page. So you can see their peer group relativity, which is 94%. This is above the threshold of 75%. They've had a total of 322 inspections, 181 of those vehicle inspections, and 75 of those have been out of service. And if you notice the red at the top, that's our indication that they are out of service violations. So a regular violation is displayed in blue, and then we put the hours of service violations on the top or indicate them separately by making them red. Now on the CSA page of the CAB report, you're going to see a quick breakdown of the SMS scores or the basic scores. Now, if you'll notice here, we have just the 6 different categories, even though there is a crash basic that would also be included. But we're going to show you not available if they do not have, or excuse me, on controlled substance, if you notice there's nothing in there, that is because they do not have adequate information to have a score in that particular category. So that should not be uncommon if you see that. Now, as a side note, what I'm displaying to you here is not the same carrier that I showed you for the prior basic scores, which is why hazmat shows not available. So don't be alarmed. Rich pointed that out earlier. I used 2 different carriers on purpose, and that was just to keep the information easier to see. So this is a different one than what we were looking at in the prior 2 screens. But if you'll notice here, each one of these unsafe, hours of service, driver fitness, and vehicle maintenance have a big red box around it. That is our indication that they are in alert status. So again, they may be below the threshold but have that red box around it if they've had a serious violation. Also, if you'll notice underneath or right above the 82 percentile for unsafe driving, that bar is red. Anytime our bar is red is our indication that they are above the threshold. If a carrier is below the threshold, that bar that measures their peer group relativity will actually be blue. So that's how you can go in and quickly tell if they are above or below the threshold. We give you their ranking or their basic score up on the top right-hand corner of each of the categories. And if you'll notice, directly below the category is a number, and that is a hyperlink to the violations in that category. So when we saw the breakdown of the vehicle maintenance for the other carrier that I had pulled up, you would see a long list of all of those different violations that showed up on that graph, and the numbers, when you click on it, is going to expand, and it is going to give you a complete breakdown of the violations they have had in that particular category. So it's very easy to navigate through and see which violations are contributing to this motor carrier's basic scores. Now the history page. As I pointed out before, we purposely do not trend out or try to estimate future scores, and that's very intentional on our behalf, but we do provide historical trends. So you can see if a motor carrier is getting better or worse over a period of time. Now, I have just snapshotted an hours of service trend for you on the screen. When you go into the CAB basic score or the history tab, you will be able to see all of the different categories that we provide information for. The blue line represents their score, and the red line in the middle of the screen is the threshold. So if that blue line is above the red line, that means they're above the threshold. And you'll notice down below it, where we show you in the alert graph, you'll notice in July of 2015, there is no alert, and that's because they jumped down below the threshold for that particular month. So anytime they are in alert status, we're going to put that little exclamation mark in the yellow triangle directly below the graph to indicate to you whether or not they are in alert status. And then right above that in the line where it says score, you'll be able to see what their actual relativity was or what their score was for that particular month. And we give you the count of inspections they've had in each of those months. So you can see with this particular carrier, as their volume of inspections went up, so did their basic score. So obviously, this carrier was not doing anything to improve their hours of service situation, because the more that they were inspected, the worse their scores got. And if you'll notice, in January, February, and March of last year, there's an NA there. And that, again, goes back to what I was explaining before as to why a carrier may not always have a score. At that time, they did not have adequate information to actually have a score calculated. It wasn't until April of 2015 that their first score was, there was adequate enough data to actually give them a score in the hours of service. And just as a side note, yeah, go ahead, Rich.
So Tiana, those of us that like to read picture books, you know, that's what we liked about the old SMS site, was that, you know, we could see these kinds of pictures, right, to show us things. And so we don't get to see those pictures anymore. When is the public view going to come back? I mean, we have a great tool here that you're showing us, you know, and you have people that used to be able to help motor carriers by just going online and looking at it. Today they don't get to. When are the feds going to show them that stuff again, like this?
Right. You know, Rich, that's a good question. I kind of hinted around it a little bit when we were talking about when these went away.
Yep.
And you know, at this time, we're at a minimum of 18 months during the study. Who knows what happens after that? And I think you've been around.
I bring it up for the fact that, you know, if Tommy were on here, he'd be blaring it out to us, right? It's the government. Mm-hmm. You know, so I just need to reinforce that if you don't have a tool available somehow, somewhere to extract and be doing these kinds of things to help your motor carriers, you know, it's not going to be back visible from inside of 18 months. We know 2 years, 36 months or longer, right, before any of this comes along. So these are great things, and I just want to really reinforce the value of this kind of analysis to help your carriers.
Yeah, thank you, Rich. And one correction I do want to make. I did say there were 8 basics. There are actually 7 there are 6 that have been on CAB. The hazmat we've had private. We've added the crash, which is the 7th. So excuse my funny math when I said 8. It actually is 7 categories. We're now displaying all 7 of those. So I added 2 for the hazmat when it was actually just 1. So again, there are 6 that you've seen on the CAB site forever. The hazmat we've shown unavailable. We're now displaying that. And now the 7th one, which is the crash basic, is going to be available to our users as well. And thank you, Rich. That was a great point. So Analysis Central. This is the newest kid in the lineup of CAB tools. We're really excited about this. Analysis Central is just getting started, and we have a lot more we're going to do with it in the future. But one of the key things in Analysis Central that I really wanted to bring to everybody's attention today, and going back to the point I made earlier, we're not just giving you the basic scores, but we're giving you tools to understand the basic scores. Analysis Central is one of those huge tools. Now, what I have displayed for you is just a snapshot of what is called our VIN-based basic analysis. So for those of you who are users of CAB, when you are in a CAB report and you go to the Analysis Central tab, there is a report there that is called the VIN-based basic analysis. And what this report does is it breaks down the basic scores for you by vehicle. And so from an agency perspective, this is very critical from an agency perspective, and then underwriting, I'm going to address that with you in just one second. This report gives you the information you need to sit down with a motor carrier and show them which vehicles are contributing the most to their basic scores. And so we group them in descending order, meaning the vehicles that have contributed the most to that particular category they go from the top down, and we break it into the different categories. So if you'll notice over here on the far left-hand side, we have the unsafe driving category. These are the only 3 vehicles that have contributed to their unsafe driving, each one a single violation. And then hours of service, and this list goes down for many vehicles for hours of service, but you'll see this vehicle that ends in 25293 has 68 points. That one particular vehicle has contributed quite significantly to their hours of service score. And if you notice, that same vehicle shows up in the unsafe driving as well. So from an agent perspective, you are able to take this information, sit down with the motor carrier and say, it's these 3 or 4 vehicles that are giving you the most violations that are weighing against your basic scores. Now, from an underwriting perspective, this gives you the ability to see if the scores you're dealing with are isolated to 1 or 2 vehicles. So if you're dealing with an owner-operator fleet, is it 1 or 2 owner-operators? Or is it spread across the entire fleet, thus more of a management issue and not necessarily isolated to 1 or 2 units? So this is a very powerful tool that will help you identify really where the source of the issue is. And then also, which I was not able to put on the screen for you, when you scroll to the far right, it's going to show you the violation weight and the time weight of these violations. So you'll have an idea as to how long this violation is going to be on the motor carrier's record and how long it's going to be held against that motor carrier and how soon that violation weight will change and thus decrease the actual weight of this overall violation. So there's a lot of analysis available on this tool. It only takes a few minutes to get in there, understand it, and then once you understand how this report works, you can pull this report on any motor carrier you're looking at, get a thorough, in-depth understanding of why the motor carrier's basic scores are the way that they are, which vehicles are contributing to it, and you'll be able to process this information fairly quickly once you become familiar with the basic layout of the information. So this is a new tool and feature that we've built into the CAB report. There are many other reports in Analysis Central, but this one is specifically relevant to the basic scores, which is why I particularly wanted to point this one out to you. Again, if you are using the CAB report and you have any questions about this, how to access this or use this, please don't ever hesitate to reach out to us. We are always happy to answer your questions and go through this with you. But this report is actually very handy, very useful from both an agent perspective and an underwriting perspective, and in particular, a loss control perspective. This will be a very powerful tool for those loss control representatives that are listening today.
And I just want to I mean, what a great focused, targeted element for an agent, loss control, whatever. What are you doing with the driver in truck 293? B in basic stands for behavior. We have some bad behaviors, and we need to focus on it. And that VIN tool is a great way of being able to do that VIN analysis.
Well, thank you very much, Rich. And, you know, One of the things that we focus on at CAB is not just giving you information, but giving you meaningful information. You have enough information to go through. I remember those days of an underwriter, MVRs, applications, IFTAs, the CAB report, the basic scores. What do you want to look at? There's so much information being thrown at you that our mission at CAB is to compile the information and make it as easy as possible to get in and understand the meaningful meat of the data that you need to get into. So we'll do a quick summary, and then we'll actually turn it over for questions. My objective was to finish a little bit early today and make sure we had plenty of time for anybody to ask any questions that they have. And I believe you can send those through the chat, and we're going to be monitoring those and answering any questions anybody has at the end of the session. So, in quick summary, the basic scores can be used to provide unique insight into the operations of a motor carrier. You know, Tommy and I have discussed a lot about how the basic scores should and should not be used. I'm not going to presume to tell any of our clients how to do their jobs. You guys are all you're doing a great job at what you do. But I do want to remind you that this is a very powerful tool to summarize a lot of the inspection and violation data. If you were to actually have to go in there and look at this like I used to back in the old SafeStat days, it can become overwhelming. So this is a very powerful tool that gives you a high-level overview of a motor carrier's overall operation. So it is a unique insight, but just keep in mind that the basic scores are just one piece of information available on the motor carrier. As Rich pointed out earlier, we've got the ISS score. You've got the ability to drill down into this. You can look at the out-of-service percentages. We also give you a breakdown of the out-of-service vehicles, just like we do the basic scores. You've got the radius of operations, the commodities they're hauling. There's a lot of information you can look at to get an overall picture of a motor carrier. And I like to look at the CAB report like pieces to a puzzle. The basic scores are just one of the pieces to the puzzle, and when you take all the information in the CAB report, plus all the information that you have on the motor carrier, and you zoom out, you put all that together and you get the full picture. And that's really what we want to encourage you to do, is use all the information available to you to make a well-rounded and complete decision. It's really easy when you're looking at a puzzle, and I'll tell you guys a funny story. I did a puzzle at Thanksgiving with my family, and I swore that there was a piece missing. There was a piece missing, and my grandmother just kept looking at me going, yes, sure, honey, yes, I'm sure that piece is not missing. And inevitably, it was there on the table, and I just missed it. And it's so easy to do that when you're looking at this data. When you get micro-focused on things, it's very easy to forget that there's a bigger picture out there. And while the basic scores are very beneficial, very meaningful, and a great summary to use, it's also just one piece of the information available. Now, as a side note, and I just want to throw this out there as a reminder to our insurance clients, that you get access to all of the data that essentially drives the basic scores. As I pointed out earlier, it's the inspection and violation data that is used to calculate the basic scores with the peer groups. We have all that data available. It's included in the insurance subscriptions, and we strongly encourage our insurance clients to take that core data, correlate it to their losses, and create their own unique ability to analyze, price, and risk select with that same data. So just keep in mind, you still have all that information. Our experienced analyst will work with you to facilitate this so you can take the actual core data and make it meaningful to your book of business. So the basic score should be a good starting point for you, but there's much more you can do with the data, and there's much more you can do to make it meaningful to your book of business. And I just want to remind our users out there that while the basic scores are a good underwriting tool, there's also a better way to use this information for your unique book of business. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to work with so many insurance carriers across the country, because all of you do things just a little bit different, and how the DOT calculates their data for their purposes is great from a high-level perspective, but you may have the ability to tie your loss data with the historical data that CAB has captured on a motor carrier and create a better way of doing that. Now, as a side note, and this is a question that I'm asked all the time, so I do want to clarify, even though the bulk of our clients are insurance companies, we do have an agent program. Our Agent Advantage program, we've had it for several years. We have a lot of agents that use CAB, both retail agents as well as brokers and MGAs. And so if you are interested as an agent in getting access to this information now that the basic scores are gone, we do have a program specifically for that. Now, this isn't a commercial as much as it is. I do want to let you know that that is available, because I'm asked all the time, Does CAB actually have a program for agents? And we absolutely do. And I just wanted to point that out. Even though I'm talking right now specifically in this slide to the insurance industry, that does not mean that we do not have a product for insurance agents as well. So in summary, knowledge is power. At the end of the day, the only way to make good decisions about your book of business is to understand the risk that you're taking on. So proper risk selection requires knowledge of the carrier's operations and its potential for risk. And CAB provides underwriters the tools necessary to calculate risk, make informed decisions, and assist insureds in better performance. And as our CEO put it here at the very bottom, use it wisely. And I could not agree more with that statement. Again, this is not just a tool for underwriters, but because today's group tends to focus on underwriters, that's what the focus of today's session has been on. But, you know, essentially, and I've said this 6 ways to Sundays already in today's session, our intent is to give you the tools you need to make the right decisions, to get that complete picture on a motor carrier, understand what it is you're underwriting, pricing, and so you can do complete, thorough risk selection based on a full set of data. So with that said, Rich, I'm going to turn it back over to you for any questions or comments, and also turn it over to the audience if anybody has any questions. Rich and I are going to stay around on the phone and make sure that we have given you adequate time to ask any questions or send any comments that you may have.
You have a chat window if you guys want to put anything in there and submit it. We have several minutes here that we can cover it. The reality is of what was presented today, you know, we no longer have the view, the dynamic of what was given to us by the federal government to use. Can we go out there and get a hold of raw data, try to crunch it out, try to do some of this analysis? Sure. There are a lot of enterprises. You've heard presenters from Vigilo as an example. 10 Street is another one. You know, there's many that try to help motor carriers to do these things. You're talking listening today to someone that comes from your world, and you as an insurance agent, even if you don't subscribe, you know that you're impacted by this because of so many insurance carriers and the underwriters using it. So I hope you found this to be useful. If you need any clarification of anything that we went over today, please use this opportunity right now. I'm going to remind you that this is part of the monthly webinars. Next month, March 10, 2 p.m., you'll be receiving an invite for another one to come along. I was hoping that Beth would allow me to reveal the topic, but you know, we're keeping that under wraps so that you paid attention to today. But you will receive the invite for next month. Tiana, again, I want to thank you for what you personally do and what this product has done. I think it was a great reminder of what goes on, the reality of you day in and day out as an agent, trying to deal with the factors that are going on, getting your customers aware. I hope that you can now speak more intelligently to your customers, make sure that they have a PIN, that they know how to access their SMS data, that they know what their ISS scores are, and then you likewise, when you're working with your underwriters, that you can ask a more specific pointed question on how to overcome what may be the objection to considering a risk. And as an underwriter, I hope that you've learned some things that now can be, you know, addressed back and forth, that we can use this. This is just a tool. This does not indicate risk quality. I think we want to stress that. It's only us looking at data, federal government data, that they are using in the enforcement world, and that is still not intended for underwriting. Tommy pointed that out many times over if you've been to his programs when you read the disclaimer on the federal website, but it's out there, and we know that people are using it to make these kinds of decisions, even though we've been advised not to. So I don't know if you have any other stories or contributing comments to that end. Tiana, you've made some great observations throughout the presentation today. You know, it seems like this has been around forever, a lot longer than the few years that you've talked about. You know, PSP is another confusing thing that exists out there. That's the ability of a motor carrier when they go to hire someone to pull this driver-specific data. That's not this system. It's a, you know, that's a different system that looks at the crash data, the roadside data to a driver. But, you know, I just share with you that another element of kind of underwriting a driver is, if it's an owner-operator, that you can look at their VIN data, and that again was part of what was presented here, that you can see kind of the historical history of problems, good or bad, right, that may have arisen with a owner-operator. So keep all these things in mind, and I hope that you found today beneficial. Not having any questions, I'm not going to hold you a lot longer. I want to, again, thank Beth for helping us get going today, and Tommy for putting this together, and more importantly, thank you, Tiana, and everything that goes on over at CAB. If anybody has questions, you're going to get a follow-up note that you can submit them in. If needed, they'll be routed back to Tiana, and I'm sure that you have your email address and everything on the Central Analysis website, the CAB website.
Yes.
And
Yep.
if you're not a subscriber, I strongly encourage you to follow their monthly newsletter. The Bits and Pieces is always extremely educational. Great piece of information that they provide to the industry. So, anything else, Tiana?
No, that's all, Rich. I would just say thank you, and thank you to everybody for your time today. I hope you walked away learning a thing or two about the basics course. That was our objective, and our objective was to just let you know how we were able to replicate that information for you, and hopefully make sure you didn't miss a beat. And just to remind everybody that just because they're not on SMS doesn't mean they went anywhere. They're still very much alive, still very much being used, and it's still very important to understand how the DOT is viewing a motor carrier and how they are responding to a motor carrier's operations. And so you still have that unique insight into a motor carrier's operations through the basic scores we were able to create. And Rich, thank you all so much for your time. You've put a lot of time and energy into this as well, and we really appreciate it. We appreciate this foundation and their mission in the insurance industry.
And I'm looking at my notes. One last thing that Tiana said today that you as an agent can really stress. Motor carriers, your MCS 150 needs to be accurate and updated. And if you see flags when you go out there that they have not updated their mileage, that could be working against them. And again, if they don't keep that current, they can lose their DOT number, and they can have that pulled, and then all of a sudden they're no longer eligible to operate as a motor carrier, and then they have to go through the reinstatement process. So keep all those things in mind. There's a lot of moving parts to all this, so thank you all. We're going to end on that note, and have a good day. See you next month.